All right, guys, we're going to talk a little bit in this unit about forest ecosystems. So far, what we've covered has basically been, as far as biodiversity, been protecting individual species and the threats to individual species. But really, what's almost more important is the ecosystems themselves, because if an ecosystem goes down, there are a lot of species that depend on that ecosystem that could then collapse. So a very important part of protecting our biodiversity then is to keep our ecosystems as intact as possible. So we're going to talk specifically about forests here. There are two main sort of normal types of forests. We have what we call old growth forests. Those are primary forests. These are forests that have been around for hundreds of years essentially and really aren't cut very much. There's not really a whole lot that's been logged out of them, definitely not in an industrial sort of sense. And then we have what we call secondary growth forests, which is after succession of some kind. So maybe there's been a fire, or maybe it's just been that humans have logged a lot and then the forest has regrown after that. That would be a secondary growth forest. What we can also have, of course, are actual human planted forests, particularly if they're planted in rows in sort of a plantation or farm sort of setup. The obvious problem with this, as you just look at this, is there's not a whole lot of biodiversity here. There's one, this is obviously a Christmas tree farm, but I mean, there's one type of tree. There's probably one or two types of grass underneath it, and then a few animal species that can excel in those particular types of trees. And so the biodiversity goes down if you have single tree forests that are planted for a specific reason. That happens a lot, actually, when we log and then we say, well, we're going to replant that. If it gets replanted as one type of tree, the biodiversity goes down. This happens a lot with pine forests, or a forest that originally had maybe multiple kinds of trees, and then as they get replanted, they're pretty much all pine forests. All right, so we want to talk about what are the value of forests, okay? So, I mean, why do we want to protect a forest ecosystem? Aside from the fact of the species inside of it, or I mean, that can be part of it, but what's the value of the ecosystem as a whole? Well, first off, as with just about any ecosystem, it's going to support energy flow in the trophic levels. It's going to support geochemical cycling, our nitrogen cycle, our phosphorus cycle, our carbon cycle, our water cycle. All of those things are supported by forests. Really super important things that it's going to reduce soil erosion. It's going to help to keep soil in place. Forests do an excellent job of this. It's going to help to regulate water flow. It's going to absorb water. It's going to release it at a fairly steady pace and absorb it at a steady pace. So it helps to be a control system for water. It's going to help to purify both water and air. We talked a lot earlier in this year about wetlands purifying water. Forests do that as well. What they also do a lot is to purify air, which is super important. They're going to influence climate a lot. They're going to cool the ground. They're going to take a lot of carbon dioxide out of the air, and that's the stored carbon part here. And so all of that is going to influence climate in their area, their regional climate. And then, of course, they're going to provide wildlife habitats, and that's sort of the biodiversity thing that we're thinking about. In addition to those ecological services, there are economic services. Wood for fuel, lumber to build houses, pulp for paper, things for the mining industry, areas for certain types of livestock to graze, goats in particular like to graze in forests, recreational things obviously, and then the jobs that are attached to all of those things are the economic value within our forests. So forests are pretty valuable to us, and they're something that really needs to be protected. So what then are the major threats to forests? Well, probably the biggest threat, of course, is that of logging. Now, and this is by no means a polemic against the logging industry. We need the logging industry. We use a lot of wood products, and on the whole, as long as we manage it sustainably, lumber is a renewable resource. Okay, so let me get that out of the way right away. We're not making a bash against the lumber industry. But of course, unchecked and with no restraints on it or no regulations on it, there are dangers to overlogging. So first off, I want to talk real briefly about the couple of types of logging that can occur. There are actually three. We're going to talk about the two major ones. I'll mention the third one. The first method is that of clear cutting, which basically just says we're going to remove all of the trees in an area. We're going to harvest them all, no matter what their size. If they're big trees, obviously they're great for lumber, and if they're small trees, we'll use them for pulp and things like that. We're just going to do it all. There are lots of benefits to that. that will pop in here. I mean, obviously it's much easier and sort of cheaper to do that. You don't have to sort of go, and it doesn't take as much time. Um, you get all the economic benefits sort of immediately in a burst as opposed to over the course of time. But obviously there's a lot of environmental damage there. If you clear cut that stuff, then all of those values to the forest that we just talked about essentially are not there at all anymore. And particularly probably the most immediate danger is of really rapid soil erosion. That soil goes away really quickly when a region gets clear cut. And then even if you come back and try to replant things later on, probably just not going to be possible. The probably more sustainable thing that's possible to do here is what's called selective cutting. And what happens there is that they go in and the mature trees or the intermediate trees get cut individually or in small groups, and then it leaves the rest of the trees to mature. And so, of course, what that does is that's much more sustainable in many ways, because obviously the soil isn't going to just go away or erode. You've still got trees there performing their climate services and their water services. But that means that maybe in 5 to 10 years that area is going to be able to harvest it again as those trees that were younger start to mature more, and then it gives a chance for more trees to start to be able to come up and grow. And so if you're only harvesting the most mature trees and leaving the rest behind, that's a very sustainable model to do. There's also a model called strip cutting, which is sort of like selective cutting and clear cutting merged together. But what happens is they'll basically cut all of a strip out and leave the forest on both sides of it. And then they'll come back 10 years later and maybe harvest the next strip once that strip in between has got a chance to sort of grow up in between. Still has the advantages of selective cutting in that, obviously if there's only one band cut out, there's still a lot there to hold down the soil and stuff like that. But also has the benefit of clear cutting that you can just go through that area really swiftly. Other types of threats to forest, I mean, obviously fires, we sort of think of that immediately as soon as we think about forests. There are two really big types of forest fires. The surface fires are the ones that sort of burn out the underbrush and the leaf litter, and yes, some trees will get burned, but probably not burned down. You'll see scorch marks on them, but the trees themselves usually are able to stay alive. These are kind of the fires that we want, and in fact the kind of fires that get set in prescribed burns, because we want the underbrush to burn off. Because if there's a lot of underbrush there all of the time, then we run the risk of these big crown fires where the fires are sort of leaping from tree to tree, and they're going to burn all of the trees and all of the underbrush until essentially you've got nothing left in that whole forest, and obviously the whole ecosystem is destroyed in that case. In the case of a surface fire, the niches in the lower parts with the underbrush obviously are destroyed, but the upper parts in the canopy can still survive and can still provide all that shade cover to be able to regrow all the canopy. Or all the underbrush rather, sorry. Other threats, invasive species. This is probably one of the most devastating threats nowadays, is that if we bring in species that happen to attack particular types of trees, be it a beetle or something like that, they're going to devastate the trees, those types of trees. And then, of course, if that was a major tree in that forest, then whether or not the rest of the forest can survive is up for grabs. And then maybe, if it kills off that one type of tree, other trees grow up, and maybe then again you've got a monoculture where you got one type of tree and you don't have as much biodiversity there. Climate change also has the risk of endangering forests as temperatures change. Now, on the whole, forests are a little bit more resilient to this than other types of biomes and ecosystems, because trees tend to be a little bit more resilient. But obviously, if you've got a lot of drastic cold in an area that didn't normally have that, that's going to put that forest at risk a lot. Overall, we generally sort of talk about the idea of deforestation, and deforestation basically means that we're removing large expanses of forest. Usually this happens for a couple of reasons, usually for agriculture or for human settlement. And it happens sort of in this distinctive pattern here, and we're going to talk about this pattern in the next slide as well, but this pattern is what's called a fishbone pattern. You can kind of see that. You got sort of a central thing and then sort of like little feathery things going out. And what this is roads that, one big road that goes through, and then another branching road, and then a bunch of little branches off of that. And this is the way deforestation happens. It isn't essentially usually meant to just sort of clear cut the whole area. Usually there's a road built, and then there's some logging going on, or maybe some houses or something built off of there. But then that sort of metastasizes, and over the course of time, it gets bigger and bigger. And it's eventually, over the course of time, you've got a subdivision or a suburb there where there was once a forest or a commercial development or a clear-cut logged area or farms. We don't think of farms as environmentally harmful, but they really are in a lot of ways that we'll talk about in the future here. But that area gets clear-cut, and now it's cattle grazing or something like that. This is happening particularly at a rapid rate, and where we tend to think of this is in the Amazon. That's actually where this picture is from. This is a picture of the Amazon in Brazil. The degradation of tropical forests, tropical rainforests in particular, is extremely worrisome to us environmentally speaking, and these are the main causes. Obviously, you're going to build roads first, and then settlements, fires. A lot of times those fires are set intentionally because they want to be able to set up agricultural areas. They want to be able to set up cattle ranching. One of the biggest problems in Argentina and Brazil is that they cut down large swaths of their forests because they have a very cattle-based culture, which isn't in and of itself a bad idea, but obviously if you're cutting down vast swaths of rainforest just to grow cattle, a cattle ranch is not very biodiverse at all, and it's kind of set up for one type of species, and so you're losing a lot of biodiversity in that area. And then, of course, logging. In the rainforest, of course, there are a lot of really exotic, expensive hardwoods that are very economically valuable, and so they get cut down a lot. And as they're getting cut down, the forest as the whole gets to a point. The danger is that we're worried that we're reaching a tipping point where the forest isn't going to be able to recover, that there's not going to be enough to support the rainforest as a whole, that erosion and the regional climate change is eventually going to reach a point that it's not going to be a rainforest anymore, that it's essentially going to turn into a savanna. Not that there's something endemically wrong with the savanna, of course, but if you're sacrificing species that were there to only create the ones in the savanna, that's obviously a big loss to biodiversity. So let's talk real briefly about what some of the effects of deforestation are. If you'll notice, this is what I said were the positive ecological effects of a forest on the whole. So I just want to sort of, the deforestation effects are basically the opposite of those, the counters of those. And so if our positive effect was that it helped geochemical cycling and reduced erosion, that as we deforest, the erosion is going to get really bad. The nutrients are going to flow away. The cycle doesn't get completed in the same ways that it originally did. If one of the important jobs of the forest was to absorb and release water, that effect is no longer there, and so the flooding processes get accelerated a lot. In fact, we saw that, if you remember, we watched some videos about Haiti at the beginning of the year, and since they've cut down about 98% of their forests in Haiti, they're really prone to a lot of flooding now. The influence to climate, as we cut down the forest, regional climate changes a lot. Again, we go from a temperature where it was supportive of a tropical rainforest to a savanna, and the overall temperature in the region is probably going to go up by a couple of degrees. Going up by a couple of degrees also changes the precipitation patterns as well. And so that causes a lot of heartache to what might have been a great farming area isn't anymore just outside of the rainforest, because the climatic patterns have changed around that as the forests were cut down. The ability to store carbon, obviously, as rainforests are cut down, that CO2 in general is going to be released into the atmosphere as the forests get burned, or at least a large chunk of them gets burned. And so that carbon sequestration of the forest, pulling the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere into themselves, isn't there, and that carbon dioxide's back out in the atmosphere, accelerating the greenhouse effect. And obviously, the habitats for the wildlife are going to be destroyed as deforestation occurs. So what can we do to help that out? I mean, what sorts of ways can we manage our forests to help this out? Well, the first way, and I meant to click these in individually, sorry that I didn't. The first way is that we can manage our forest fires. We can have prescribed burns. We can purposely thin out the forest so that when fires do occur, that they're not as dramatic. That's one of the things that a lot of our park services and the Fish and Wildlife Services try to manage for us. As consumers, we can reduce demand for harvested trees. We can be much more efficient about their uses. We can find alternative fuel sources in those areas where they're cutting down their trees just for fuel sources. Can we use alternative things like other types of biomasses? Can we use maybe animal dung, which sounds really weird, but there are a lot of areas that they actually use that as a fuel source. in large part in many cases because they don't have access to wood, but can we use those things instead of trees so that we can keep the forest there? Another way that doesn't get thought of a lot really is, can we concentrate forests in areas that are already cleared instead of clear cutting a forest? Is there an area that is already clear, relatively clear, that could then be used for that agricultural purpose instead of cutting down a new area? Then of course we can plant trees, and remember again that we're not talking about planting trees sort of in the commercial sense of just like, let's replant a bunch of pine that's going to grow quickly, get harvested again, replant, because that's a monoculture and it's not very biodiverse. We want to try to plant it in such a way that it's a diversity of trees and therefore going to be a diversity of other species there as well. And then of course, last and certainly not least, is to try to protect those old growth forests as much as possible. If we can practice selective cutting there so that we don't clear cut the forest, so that we can let that forest ecosystem as intact as we can manage, so that we can protect all that biodiversity. All right, thanks a lot guys. Again, sorry about the voice. Hopefully you still got maximum value out of this video.